Welcome back, everyone. Grateful to have you joining us on this first Monday, the 2nd of February, 2026, for another edition of Crime in the Courtroom. Just a few moments ago, I wrapped up a conversation with a really interesting guy, Brian Joseph, an investigative reporter who recently authored an important and perhaps timely book called Vegas Concierge: Sex Trafficking, Hip Hop, and Corruption in America. As you know, we've had our share of sex scandals recently, not the least of which has been the Sean P. Diddy Combs case, as well as the Jeffrey Epstein case, which will likely be in the news for some time to come, I imagine. In fact, as you listen to my conversation with Mr. Joseph, and as you hear Brian talk about the plight of the victims and survivors of these crimes, I'd ask that you keep in mind that one of Jeffrey Epstein's alleged victims took her own life not too long ago. That was in April of last year. In fact, NBC News described Virginia Giuffre as one of Epstein's most potent accusers, but her death is obviously a stark reminder of the pain that is inflicted on those who are exploited and preyed upon in the crimes that we're going to be discussing today. And to that end, thank goodness we have teams of experts like my friends and colleagues at Promega, our loyal season sponsor and the host of the International Symposium on Human Identification, the largest conference in existence dedicated to the practice, challenges, and opportunities of forensic DNA testing. This year's symposium will be held in Providence, Rhode Island, October 26th to the 29th. Please visit ishinews.com. That's ishinews.com for more information. And come join us and see firsthand how the outstanding team of life science experts at Promega are turning questions into discoveries each and every day. You can learn more about Promega and their important mission of applying life science to enhancing and protecting our quality of life. Learn more at promega.com. That's PROMEGA.com. One of the great frustrations that someone like me, who's been in the criminal justice system and has witnessed the horrors that are inflicted on our fellow citizens by the predators who are out there. And when I say predators, I'm not talking necessarily about socioeconomically or even cognitively or emotionally disadvantaged individuals who often commit their crimes out of fear, survival, or just plain emotional distress, but rather individuals who are smart and calculating and manipulative and have a complete disregard for human feeling or even human life itself. These are individuals who exist in our society and may always exist, but to the extent that they prey upon others, they seek out the vulnerable. And as I discussed with my guest, Brian Joseph, we just seem to have a way in our society of creating conditions in which the vulnerable become even more vulnerable. And the crime of sex trafficking is one that I think is enabled by a lack of public attention and even a lack of competence when it comes to the formulation of relevant public policies. As I mentioned at the outset, Brian Joseph is an investigative reporter, and he was kind enough to accept my invitation to join me on the show to talk about his book and the sex trafficking that goes on under our noses in communities all across America. So with that, please enjoy my conversation with Mr. Brian Joseph. So what I'd like to start with, if I could, is your experience as an investigative reporter. Can you tell us about that, and how did you get into that? I'm always fascinated by investigative reporting.
Well, I think a lot of people are. I think it's also not nearly as glamorous as folks might make it out to be, or the media or Hollywood makes it out to be. Uh, I should say that in my immediate family, I don't have any journalists in my immediate family, but at a fairly young age, my parents pegged me as a journalist, given my interest in writing and current events. And then I don't know that they really thought this through at the moment, but also my interest in people and my ability to connect with people and my just desire to understand people in the world.
Sure.
So I discovered journalism on my own as a sophomore in high school. I was sort of looking for a path, and at the time, my high school had a brand new, young and charismatic journalism advisor, and I gravitated to him, and very quickly found my way on the student newspaper, and got into a lot of trouble working there, and did a couple of stories that made the principal unhappy, and I just really loved the work, loved the experience, and by the time I graduated from college, I knew this is what I wanted to do, and I grew up, was raised in Omaha, Nebraska, and just so happened that about 5 short hours from Omaha is the University of Missouri and its famed Missouri School of Journalism, which is where I went to college,
Okay.
and really got to learn from one of the best journalism institutions in the country. Did a number of internships in college, including my last one at the Seattle Times, where I talked my way onto the investigative desk, and was involved in a undercover investigation of an Asian antiquities dealer that was selling fake Asian antiquities. That story won a George Polk Award, and I was at the time one of the youngest ever to have won that award. From there, I graduated from Missouri and took my first job in Southern California, working for a small paper in Palm Springs. I covered the excuse me the city down there, and then moved up to Sacramento, where I worked for the Sacramento Bee and the Orange County Register, and then later did a mid-career fellowship at the University of California, Berkeley, for mid-career journalists, where I did a large investigation into privatized foster care for Mother Jones Magazine. Worked for a small nonprofit news organization after that, and then joined the Las Vegas newspaper, where I began my investigation into domestic sex trafficking, which led to my book.
So that was what came across my desk when I learned about your book, and you were kind enough to come on to talk about it. It's called Vegas Concierge: Sex Trafficking, Hip Hop, and Corruption in America. Could you, Brian, just kind of give us an overview of kind of what the book is about and the story that you're telling?
Vegas Concierge uses the years-long investigation into a hip hop music producer, Molly Maul, as a narrative vehicle to explore how American society fails victims and survivors of sex trafficking.
Okay. So I can imagine that there was a lot of books that you could have written. Why did you feel that this one had to be written? Like, what was it that was sort of putting the wind in your sails on it?
As I delve deeper into the issue of sex trafficking in the United States, I came to view sex trafficking survivors and victims as the most marginalized people in our society. These are individuals that oftentimes have had horrible things happen to them long before they ever got involved in the sex trade. They may have been abused in foster care. They may have, lost a parent or a sibling to violence. They may have just had very hard circumstances in their young lives. These are people that anyone with an ounce of humanity would have compassion for. Something horrible has happened earlier in their lives. A pimp then comes along and uses those terrible life circumstances to pick at their self-esteem, to manipulate them into sex trafficking, where they're then horribly victimized in the sex trade. They are under the gun to make thousands of dollars for their cold-hearted pimps every night. They may be asked to have intercourse with numerous individuals over the course of a single day. They may be arrested by certain police officers who aren't compassionate to what they've gone through. That's their second victimization.
Mhm.
And then the third victimization is once they get out of that lifestyle, they are confronted by a society that dismisses them as hoes, that doesn't allow them to get jobs or to forget about their past, or largely just makes them feel bad about themselves. These are individuals that at 3 points in their lives have been victimized, and still at the end of the day, we in American society think they're dirty, awful, immoral women, and that is deeply unjust to me.
I the timing of this conversation and probably the timing of the book was interesting in the terms in terms of some things that have been going on in contemporary society with regards to this issue, most notably what is now the famous Epstein case. We have the Sean Combs, the P. Diddy Combs case. From as a guy that has some expertise in this area, and you've studied it, you've written about it, how do you internalize those two particular stories, or how have you internalized those and sort of analyzed them from your perspective as they've sort of played out in the public domain?
Well, I think the first observation I have about both cases is that both of those cases are focused primarily on the perpetrators. They are not focused on the victims. And that was something that I wanted to avoid in writing about the Molly Maul case and in how we approached Vegas Concierge. Vegas Concierge is focused on a very courageous victim who was willing to share her story with me. And so that's where I would start in talking about this, is that part of the reason why I think that American society doesn't quite grasp the severity of sex trafficking is that our narratives in popular culture are centered on the perpetrators. And certainly in the Diddy case and in the Epstein case, we're talking about charismatic, wealthy individuals who lived larger than life, larger than life lifestyles. So that's where I really struggle, because again, what brought me into this reporting was the victimization and how I felt that victims and survivors were being disregarded in this conversation. And while certainly the Diddy case and the Epstein case in particular have become lightning rods politically and socially, I am disturbed that they are not focused still on the victims and on their stories and on the harm that they've experienced. We just sort of use this shorthand, oh, Epstein was a bad guy, and, we need to release the list, and, that sort of thing, instead of talking about, substantive reforms, talking about, the struggles that their survivors have had to move on with their lives. I think both of those cases, particularly the Diddy case, well, actually both of those cases, given that Epstein initially, got a pretty easy deal from the feds. Both of those cases really illustrate, I think, how our justice system is unprepared to handle these cases in a substantive way. Certainly, they've both gotten in trouble. Certainly, there's been a lot of headlines. But this is modern day slavery, and this should be, I would argue, a top priority for both our politicians and for our law enforcement community. And the way both of these cases have played out certainly suggest that, at least initially, these cases aren't taken with the seriousness that they need to be. And that is deeply upsetting to me, and I believe deeply upsetting to the survivor community.
I sometimes wonder if that lack of emphasis is the result of people in positions of authority not really being able to bring it within themselves to believe that this stuff is actually happening. I think about, for example, the famous Joe Paterno case at Penn State University and what he was accused of and what he was turning his back on. It was a different kind of a crime. But I remember thinking about that case, and then I read Malcolm Gladwell's description of it, and I couldn't help but wonder that somebody of his generation at his age, if it was one of those things where he couldn't even process what was going on in his own locker room. And that may be letting him off the hook or absolving him of accountability. Do you think there's any truth to any of that? Do you think people can grasp what's actually happening?
Well, in the most simple response to that statement or that question, yes, I don't think people can grasp that, because I don't know that victims and survivors have felt empowered in our society to share their stories. Instead, they felt judged and demeaned.
Yeah.
That's why I was so grateful for the survivor that sits at the center of Vegas Concierge, for her candor and courage and her willingness to speak out about exactly what her experiences were like and exactly how the trafficking experience harmed her. I think in the case of the Sandusky situation, the Sandusky scandal, uh, Joe Paterno, that was the guy he knew. I don't know that he really engaged in understanding what the victims' stories were like. And I think had he, or at least I would hope had he might better grasp the severity of what was going on. Certainly, I've never reported on that. I don't want to, draw conclusions without any facts. But certainly, as I've looked at this issue in general, what I've seen time and time again is that people do not understand the lived experiences of survivors, and because of that lack of understanding, they are quick to dismiss this issue. And again, I want to make very clear that the reason why survivors' stories haven't been heard is because we as a society make it so difficult for them to tell those stories, because we judge them, because we think ill of them, and because it can be very traumatizing for them. And we as a society have not made it have not created an environment where they can share their stories without judgment and with a sense of safety so that we can better understand this issue. And it is my hope that Vegas Concierge move that conversation forward, just a little bit.
One of the frustrations that you're on record of expressing is what you called the glorification of pimping in America, which is where we kind of take it to the next level, where it's no longer just ignoring that something has happened, but actually there's a can you explain what you meant by that
Well,
glorification or
well,
celebration of
so
pimping?
so it's so obviously my book talks about hip hop, and certainly there are songs and
Yeah.
artists that glorify pimping. But I want to make very clear that there seems to be a gap between performance and reality when it comes to that. The survivor featured in Vegas Concierge happened to be a good friend with the now deceased UGK rapper Pimp C. Pimp C in his name and in his persona and in his raps embodied the pimp, the pimp lifestyle. But as depicted in a biography about him, Sweet Jones, The Trill Life of Pimp C by Julia Beverly, Pimp C was very concerned about this woman's work in prostitution and wanted her to protect herself. So this was a guy who, in his portrayals of pimping, glorified it, but behind the scenes was concerned about a woman in it. And so, what I think that speaks to is the fact that in our society today, that there is this chasm between, sort of the popular culture idea of what pimping is and how cool it is or how funny it is and what it really is. And I don't have a good answer for what for what songs or what artists are appropriate or not, or which ones are okay to listen to. I just know that when you hear pimp lingo in a song or see depictions of pimps in pop culture, that does not portray the realities of what trafficking and what pimping really is.
To what extent has your work in the past, Brian, sort of explored or gone deeper into hip hop as an industry, and the way that it perhaps encourages, culturally encourages criminal behavior? Is there something endemic within that industry that is producing this that we've turned a blind eye to? I mean,
So no,
how do we view that? Should we view
so
this?
I would categorically reject that notion. A lot of hip hop artists are quite young and the things that they rap about are things that they've seen on TV or they've heard from their buddies in the neighborhood, that sort of thing. And look, I mean, I think it's very true that uh, pimping has been soft pedaled in our culture. I mean, MTV, for years had a show about customizing cars called Pimp My Ride. I mean,
Oh
no
yeah,
one would accuse
yeah.
that. No one would accuse that show of being about, the exploitation of women. I think it more speaks to the fact that we as a society don't really understand what this issue truly is about, what pimping really is, how it affects the women caught up in the pimp prostitute subculture. Uh, you know, are there hip hop artists that clearly know what pimping is and are glorifying it, intentionally and with, consciously and knowing what they're talking about? I'm sure there are. But are there also likely artists that, use pimp in the way that, when I was a college kid did and would call, my buddy that looked good, oh, you pimping today? Like, I didn't know any better. Now I do. So I think it really speaks to a greater societal misunderstanding of this issue, a greater um, ignorance in American society about what pimping is and what that word really means.
Okay, so you're the notion that you're rejecting is that this is a problem that hip hop as an industry should be blamed for, that this is bigger than one industry. Is that
Absolutely, this is absolutely bigger than one industry.
okay?
And there's certainly nothing um, fundamental to hip hop that requires the exploitation of women. I mean, there's fantastic hip hop artists, Missy Elliott, uh, um, and others who have the raps don't really get into pimping at all. So I don't. Lauren Hill was the name I was searching for, as another hip hop artist that certainly you wouldn't associate with pimping. So you don't. Pimping is not synonymous with hip hop, and I thoroughly reject that idea. Is that a term that shows up in hip hop and is often used to describe loving the ladies, looking smooth, being cool? It absolutely is. And does that show a certain ignorance on the part of the people that talk about that? It does, but that same ignorance is also seen in Hollywood and elsewhere. And so, no, I firmly reject the notion that there is something intrinsic to hip hop that is relating to sex trafficking.
Well, and that's fair. But I mean, if we were to, as you're suggesting, we sort of open up or broaden our view of this, beyond simply hip hop, and we, let's say, look at Hollywood, we look at the entertainment in general, it would seem that a reasonable person listening to this conversation would say to themselves that, well, perhaps it should be a social priority to try to suppress or eliminate somehow, not necessarily through the passage of law or anything like that, because we start to get into freedom of speech issues, which is where it gets complicated. But I mean, have you thought much about, ways in which, as a society, we can sort of put the right kind of pressure on individuals in the entertainment industry broadly to not create these kinds of artistic expressions where people are, where pimping is glorified, or where sexual deviancy or sexual predation is glorified? How do we change that? And should we even try to?
Well, I think it starts with education, right? I mean, I think if both the industries and the general public are aware of this, there's not going to be an appetite for this sort of content or material. I mean, there's certainly, uh, a number of ways to describe, someone who dresses well and is cool and is rich. The term baller comes to mind. I mean, I mean, we don't have to get rid of those archetypes. We don't have to get rid of, those general categories. We just have to better understand that these specific things are, what they truly are, and we have to, as a society, both in the entertainment industry and in the general public, reject them. And I think as people begin to understand this more and begin to understand this specifically as it relates to the pimp prostitute subculture, that will happen. I mean, certainly, Hollywood has, popular culture depictions of sex trafficking where sex trafficking is viewed as villainous. In the movie Taken and in the movie The
Yeah.
Equalizer, the villains there are sex traffickers. The problem with those depictions is that they depict, you know, one form of trafficking, and certainly not one of the more visible forms of trafficking that is in the United States. It is though in popular culture there is something different between sex trafficking and pimping, when in reality they are the same thing.
Okay. I'd like to get, as a fellow author, I'm always curious about the writing process that other authors follow. For this particular book, what was the timeline for you as far as when you started to, begin constructing a manuscript to the point where it was published? What did that look like in terms of duration, and what were some of the
Sure.
challenges that you encountered along the way?
Well, I officially started applying my research on sex trafficking to a book in late 2019.
Okay, so just
I had
before the
done, I
pandemic? Just
just
before
before
the,
the pandemic.
yeah.
And so I had, and I had, 2+ years of research into sex trafficking at that point, in my notebook, so to speak. The book was published in October 2024. So it gives you a sense of the amount of time that I devoted to this.
Yeah.
The biggest challenge that I faced was a skeptical publishing industry.
Mm.
Uh, I think I think it's fair to say that uh, there was a concern that, given the topic matter, this would be a tough read for people, and that folks wouldn't be attracted to it. And that's understandable. I mean, this is a heavy topic, and it was certainly told in a candid but also very sensitive way. And I think, particularly as I was pitching this book around around COVID time, and things were pretty dark. I think there was a hesitancy on the part of publishing industry professionals to go down that path with me.
Did they feel like the timing wasn't right? Like it was just kind of like too much to digest, given everything that was going on in society?
I mean, I don't want to put words into people's mouths, but um, I certainly, got the impression that, that it was a heavy topic, and, the people were looking for hope at that time. I also had, one agent that was, very turned off on the notion that, the primary subject of the book, would be a woman engaged in prostitution. Her perception was that, those aren't sympathetic individuals, and that, just told me that this person didn't understand the issue at
Yeah.
all, and was not the right fit for me. And I was very grateful to find the agent that I did, that who understood uh, the textures of this issue and the importance of it.
Well, what, kind of predicting how readers, and obviously every reader's different, right? Every reader has different sensitivities and different pre-existing notions. One thing I am kind of curious about, though, is how how will readers' opinions about Sin City, Las Vegas, be potentially influenced by reading your book?
Uh, well, I think people who read this book will um, come to see Sin City as a place that is geared primarily towards making money, and is less concerned about the humans that pass through this adult playground. Uh, my reporting shows that the society in Vegas, both the industries, particularly the casino industry, and the authorities, uh, have a huge incentive to foster and cater to uh, tourism and the tourists who come here. And as a result, that means that less emphasis is put on uh, protecting and saving individuals that are engaged in prostitution, and the dark slave masters that are behind the scenes, exploiting those individuals. Certainly, there are wonderful and very sophisticated uh, police officers and others in this community who are focused on that, and my book
Sure.
highlights many of them, particularly a very good comp. I'm talking about the overall structures, the overall powers, and those systems, are incentivized to not care about this issue.
You know, I hate to, I've asked you some questions here. I feel like I'm putting you on the spot, but one that comes to mind, thinking about crime prevention, um, for let's say parents out there that worry about, sex trafficking, and they worry about the vulnerability of their children, is there a profile that of a, I don't want to say, because there's no such thing as a typical victim, but is there like a certain set of characteristics, lifestyle behaviors, like drug use, addiction stuff, that victims that get pulled into this seem to exhibit?
The sad answer is, there isn't a typical victim, especially in
Yeah.
today's society. Pimps are adept at recruiting through social media and through the internet, which makes, potentially, everyone, at least possibly a victim.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, Keep in mind that sex traffickers, pimps, are master manipulators, and so what they're going to do is they're going to feel any potential victim out and try to figure out where those leverage points are and exploit them. We all have leverage points. Uh, we all have things that we want. Uh, there's some quote that I'm going to get wrong. I mean, shockingly, there are actually books written by pimps where they describe their thought process and how they exploit people, which is just an
God.
amazing thing to think about. And there's a quote from one of them. I'm going to get it wrong, but something about something along the lines of, if anyone who wants anything can be pimped, and everyone wants something, or something. I'm getting it
Yeah.
completely wrong, but that's the general idea: is that if they know, if a master manipulator knows anything about what you want, they can use that to manipulate you into doing what they want, and
Yeah.
that is the concern here, and that, I think, is really the largest problem I have with pop culture depictions of sex trafficking. Of course, sex traffickers can be violent and can be cruel, outwardly so, but just as often, there's their tools of exploitation are charm and
Oh
manipulation,
yeah.
very corrosive and insidious behaviors that you do not see in pop culture very often. And that is where the threat truly lies. Because if you are, a young person, you know, uh, chatting with somebody online, you can get drawn into their web, very quickly, and then be sent off to do, very traumatizing things in the efforts to make that pimp money.
Yeah.
And that's, and that's happening, in our society today, more so than I think people realize.
Yeah, no,
And
I think you're right. And one thing just to add what you're saying is that there's an intractable problem has existed for centuries, is that we don't know how to cure psychopathy. And we know the research shows 2, 3, 4% of the human population have either psychopathic tendencies or a full-blown sociopath, what they call now antisocial personality disorder. But it's where the constellation of traits that where we park psychopathy and sociopathy. And you hit the nail on the head in that some of their biggest traits are manipulation and parasitic behaviors, and they're out there. They're in society, and and a lot of them look to exploit. But wow, they're dangerous as hell.
and then you add on top of that, if they've got some money, a nice car,
Oh
a nice
yeah,
house, nice clothes, and particularly you come from, a poorer background, or you're just a young person, and all people in general these days, we want more money,
yeah,
right? And that, person with, seeming wealth showing interest in you, and cozying up to you. I mean, that can be, very compelling, and can lead you down, a path that can ultimately be horrific.
yeah. I get concerned. We've done several show, well, not several. We've done multiple shows on this podcast talking about drug and drug leniency and drug legalization. And one of the things that scares me about that, and I've done some consulting with forensic labs that have been right in the heart of this, is that when you start injecting more drugs into already vulnerable populations, you make them even more vulnerable. And I think it's going to take us a number of years, but there's going to be some major downstream effects of some of these drug legalization efforts. And I'm not trying to give an opinion here on it, but it's all about vulnerability, right? The predators look for the vulnerable.
They do. It's interesting that you brought up drugs, because I do think there's also an important corollary to be made between the issue of drugs in our society and the issue of sex trafficking. One of the biggest issues, as I mentioned, was my concern that in American society, victims and survivors of sex trafficking aren't really truly viewed as victims. They're not viewed as sympathetic. And certainly there was a time in American history where drug users were always dismissed as bad, throwaway people, people of poor morals, people who had no self-control. But we are starting to see that change in America today, where we begin to view drug use as a substance abuse problem, as a problem that needs treatment
Right.
and needs compassion and not judgment. And I think I would like to see that same approach be given to victims and survivors of sex trafficking. These are individuals that are deserving of compassion, not disdain.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I tell you what, let me shift gears just here real quick as we start to wrap things up. As I told you before we started the recording the interview, I have always had a fascination and appreciation for investigative reporters. I had an opportunity to interview Caitlin Burchell with NBC News Connecticut, and she was doing a pretty heavy forensic story, which is how we got connected. Um, you are a freelance investigative reporter. What kind of keeps you busy on the typical day, and what kinds of activities sort of occupy your time?
That's a good question. I mean, you know, in society today, journalism, particularly investigative journalism, does not pay well. Even if you're on staff, at a big or decent sized publication. I'm a freelancer, which makes it even harder. So, I juggle a lot of assignments from a number of publications. A lot of them are to keep the lights on, to support my wife and daughter, and to keep a roof over our head. uh, Sadly, I do not have, the time to devote, most of my hours onto the big important investigations that I really care about. I mean, I spend, more of my time on assignments that pay the bills, which are less meaningful and less gratifying. Um, that's a function of the value that our society is putting on journalism, and particularly investigative journalism today. I might also add that the kind of the flavor of investigative reporting that I do, generally speaking, on sensitive topics where you have to, develop sources with individuals who, don't often have a strong incentive to talk. That particular flavor takes a long time and is quite difficult. And there are increasingly less, in my estimation, editors and publications that are willing to devote the time and resources to that kind of work. So I guess in some ways, freelancing and you know, kind of piloting my own ship in that way helps me, because I'm able to to spend the time that's necessary to do this work. But it does mean that a lot of the deeper work that I'm doing is doing it because I find it meaningful, and not because it's compensated. Um, so yeah, it's very difficult, and it's something that I struggle with a lot. I yearn for the days of patronage where someone you know would, like in the Renaissance, would find an artist that they like and decide, okay, I'm going to support this person. I wish that existed for someone like me, but it doesn't. And so by hook or by crook, by any hustle that I can, I figure a way to make this work. And so far I've been able to keep doing it, but it can be very challenging.
So I don't want you to give away any secrets, but are there any particular topics or problems that your kind of investigative mindset is drawn to, where you wish you could spend more time on it?
Well, certainly. I mean, so the stories that I'm most interested in, generally revolve around, generally start, I should say, with individuals and their stories, and those individuals being people that aren't, inclined to speak to the public, or to speak out in any sort of way. I've done reporting on foster care, um, in a very deep way, and talked, engaged in the stories of individuals that where they were really resistant to talk about what happened to them. sex trafficking certainly, fits in that mold. And, there are other sort of broad stories that I think fit into that as well. I live in Vegas. Um,
Okay.
there's increasingly scandals involving um, people engaged with casinos, whether they be casino employees or illegal bookies. I think all of that's very interesting. Um, there are certainly allegations across the country of certain political corruption issues that I think are very interesting if you can get those individuals to talk. Stories of those sort of general nature that start with individuals that are deeply disincentivized to talk are what I'm drawn to. And then on top of that, and perhaps more importantly, is I just have a deep heart for people that have been victimized. And I like the idea of, journalists talk about, comforting the afflicted and inflicting the comfortable. I'm most interested in the first part, comforting the afflicted. I think that's a wonderful um, function of journalism.
Yeah, I thank God for people like you and others that are more mission driven than profit driven, because we need people out there that do this kind of work. So as a fellow writer, I really appreciate what you're doing. Last question I have for you: how can our listeners and viewers get more information about your book, and also get more information about you and your work?
Sure. I mean, a great place to start is we have a website we're very proud of about the book, vegasconciergebook.com. It links to our social media platforms. You have a way to contact me directly through that. That's a great place to start and learn a little bit more about me and about the main subjects of the book.
Awesome. And that's all for today. Hope you enjoyed our conversation with Brian Joseph. Thank you again, everyone, for joining me for another episode of Crime in the Courtroom. As always, the opinions expressed on our show are those of your host, John Collins, that's me, as well as our guests, and should not be construed as representing the opinions of our sponsors, collaborators, or any other professionals or organizations with whom we may be affiliated. Just as a quick reminder, if you are interested in our world-class, on-demand, and affordable training program for building your authoritative presence and conflict management skills, please visit criticalvictories.com/showupstrong. And if you are a police commander, forensic scientist, or forensic laboratory administrator, or a professional in a high responsibility occupation looking for a powerful but convenient way to achieve the high resolution self-awareness necessary to be at your best, even when everything is on the line, please check out my coaching page at criticalvictories.com/coaching. That's criticalvictories.com/coaching. You can start the process without any obligation, and I would love to work with you and any members of your team striving to build the skills and internal strength they need to meet whatever new or growing responsibilities they've been entrusted with. We will see you next time for another edition of Crime in the Courtroom. Let's all be safe, be great, and let's all stay committed to being a force for good and for protecting our quality of life from sea to shining sea. Thanks again, everyone. Take care.